The autumn afternoon had that particular quality of light that belonged only to Hogwarts, golden and slow, filtering through windows that had watched generations of students pass beneath them. In the Transfiguration corridor on the 4th floor, dust motes hung suspended in the slanting beams, and the castle settled into its stones with the small creaks and sighs of a place that had stood for centuries and intended to stand for centuries more. Albus Dumbledore was supposed to be in the library. He was 12 years old, his school robes still slightly too long at the cuffs, and he had told his friend Elphias Doge that he needed a particular book on intermediate transformation theory. This was true. He did need the book. But he had found himself walking past the library entrance 3 times now, his feet carrying him elsewhere. And he had learned over his first year at Hogwarts that sometimes it was worth paying attention to where his feet wanted to go. The corridor ended at a window overlooking the grounds where the Forbidden Forest stood dark against the afternoon sky. Most students turned back here, returned to the familiar routes between classroom and common room. But Albus had noticed, weeks ago, that the stone beneath this window felt different when he stood on it. Warmer, somehow, though that made no logical sense. And today, standing there with his satchel heavy on his shoulder, he noticed something else. The wall beside the window wasn't quite flush. It was the smallest thing, a gap no wider than a quill, running vertically from floor to ceiling, barely visible in the golden light. Albus pressed his palm against the stone, feeling the coolness of it, the solidity. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so gradually he might have imagined it, the wall grew warm beneath his hand. The gap widened, not dramatically. There was no grinding of stone, no shower of dust or ancient magic crackling through the air. The wall simply shifted, the way a door might open if someone on the other side had been waiting patiently for a very long time. Beyond it lay a narrow passage, barely wide enough for one person, and a set of stairs descending into gentle darkness. Albus glanced back down the corridor. Empty. From somewhere below came the distant sound of students changing classes, a murmur of voices and footsteps that belonged to the Hogwarts everyone knew. He lit his wand, Lumos, and stepped through the gap. The stairs were worn smooth in their centers, the stone shaped by countless feet over countless years. Someone had walked this path often, once, many someones. The passage smelled of old parchment and dust, and something else, something Albus couldn't quite name, a kind of settled magic, like the feeling of a spell cast long ago and never quite fading. At the bottom of the stairs, perhaps 20 feet below the main corridor, he found a door. It was oak, dark with age, and it had no lock. The handle turned easily under his hand, well oiled despite the years. Beyond it lay a classroom that had clearly not been used for decades. Desks stood in neat rows, their surfaces scarred with the usual student markings, initials carved with careful wands, small diagrams of spell formations, the idle doodlings of minds wandering during lectures. The blackboard still held faint traces of chalk, the ghost of some long-ago lesson that had never been fully erased. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with textbooks from years Albus didn't recognize, their spines labeled with dates that reached back into the previous century. But it was the desks that drew him. He approached the nearest one slowly, his wand light casting long shadows across the carved wood. Someone named M. McGonagall had sat here in 1834 and had apparently spent a great deal of time perfecting the wand work for conjuration. Small notes crowded the margins of the desk, reminders, corrections, a tiny sketch of a bird mid-transformation. At the desk beside it, T. Flitwick, 1841, had worked through a complex problem in charms theory, the mathematics of it spiraling across the wood in careful precision. Albus moved between the rows, his fingers trailing across the surfaces. Each desk was a small archive, a record of someone who had sat here, learned here, left some part of themselves behind in wood and ink and careful notation. R. Longbottom, 1798. E. Prewed, 1856. A. Scamander, 1863. He found himself at a desk near the back, where the light from his wand fell across a name that made him pause. A. Dumbledore, 1823. His grandfather, perhaps, or a great-uncle, someone who had walked these same corridors, sat in this same classroom, carved their name into this same desk. The surface around the name was covered in notes, not academic ones, but personal. Small observations. The castle is quieter on Thursdays. The portraits in the east wing remember the goblin rebellions. There is a room on the 7th floor that wasn't there yesterday. Albus sat down slowly, his satchel sliding to the floor beside him. The desk fit him perfectly, as though it had been waiting. He traced the letters of his ancestor's name with one finger, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time, and something in his chest settled into place. This was why his feet had brought him here. The castle kept records that had nothing to do with official histories or archived documents. It kept the small things, the notes students left for themselves, the questions they'd wondered about, the tiny observations they'd made while sitting in classrooms, just like this one. And somehow, in ways Albus didn't yet understand, the castle had decided he should see them. He pulled a piece of parchment from his satchel and smoothed it across the desk. For a long moment, he simply sat there, his quill poised, thinking. Then he began to write. Found this room today. 4th floor, past the window overlooking the forest. The wall opened when I touched it, though I don't think it would open for just anyone. The castle feels different down here, older maybe, or more awake. He paused, considering his words, then added, I think Hogwarts remembers things we've forgotten. I think it wants someone to notice. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Albus attended his classes, completed his assignments with the careful precision that his professors had come to expect, spent evenings in the Gryffindor common room with Elphias and the others. But 2 or 3 times a week, when the castle was quiet and the light had that particular golden quality, he found his way back to the hidden classroom. He began to understand the pattern of the names. Students returned to this room across years, sometimes decades. Emsor McGonagall appeared on 3 different desks, her notes growing more sophisticated as she progressed through her education. A. Scamander had left observations about magical creatures that wouldn't be officially documented for another 30 years. And his own ancestor, A. Dumbledore, 1823, had filled 4 different desks with careful notes about the castle itself, as though he too had understood that Hogwarts was more than stone and magic, that it was something alive and aware and worth paying attention to. Albus added his own observations slowly, never more than a few lines at a time. The portraits on the 3rd floor landing seem to communicate with each other after students have passed. Not in words, something else. There's a house elf who tends the fires in the early morning. She hums the same song every day. I think it's older than Hogwarts itself. The Sorting Hat was singing to itself in the headmaster's office today during Transfiguration. Professor Dumbledore left the door ajar, and I could hear it. The song was about students it sorted 40 years ago, wondering what became of them. One afternoon in late October, Albus discovered something new. He had been examining a desk near the front of the classroom, running his fingers over notes left by H. Potter, 1874, when he noticed that one of the floorboards beneath the desk was slightly raised. He knelt down, pressing gently against the wood, and it lifted easily, not broken, but designed to be opened. Beneath it lay a small collection of objects, each wrapped carefully in cloth that had somehow remained intact despite the years. Albus unwrapped them one by one, laying them out in the wandlight. A quill, well used, its feather still holding a faint shimmer of magic. A small glass vial containing what looked like light. Actual light, golden and slow-moving, as though someone had captured a sunset and stopped it. A piece of parchment folded many times, covered in handwriting so faded, Albus could barely make out the words. For whoever finds this, the castle keeps what we give it. Choose carefully what you leave behind. He sat back on his heels, holding the vial up to his wandlight. The golden light within shifted and moved, and for just a moment, Albus saw something in it, a memory perhaps, or the echo of one. A much younger Hogwarts, its towers fewer, its grounds wilder, students in robes of a different cut, learning magic that hadn't yet been categorized into the neat subjects Albus studied now. The castle was showing him its own past. He rewrapped the objects carefully and returned them to their hiding place, but he took the folded parchment with him. That night, in the Gryffindor common room, while Elphias dozed in the chair beside him, Albus read the message again and again, trying to understand what it meant. The castle keeps what we give it, not takes, keeps. As though Hogwarts was a kind of guardian, holding safe the small pieces of its students' lives that they chose to entrust to it. The notes on the desks, the objects hidden beneath floorboards, the memories captured in vials of light. Albus thought about his own ancestor, sitting in that same classroom 70 years ago, making the same observations, asking the same questions. He thought about all the students who had found that room across the centuries, who had added their own small contributions to its archive, and he understood, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was part of something much larger than himself, a long, quiet conversation between Hogwarts and those who loved it enough to truly pay attention. The next time he visited the classroom, he brought something to leave behind. It wasn't much, just a small piece of amber he'd found on the grounds during his first week at Hogwarts, smooth and warm, and holding a trapped beetle that was probably centuries old itself. He wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth and placed it in the hiding spot beneath H. Potter's desk, adding to the collection there. And on his own desk, on the surface where his ancestor's name was carved, he added one more line to his notes. I'm listening. I think I'll keep listening for a long time. The golden afternoon light had deepened to amber by the time Albus finally left the classroom, climbing the worn stairs back to the main corridor. The gap in the wall closed behind him with the same gentle patience it had shown in opening, and within moments it was invisible again, just another stretch of stone in a castle full of them. But Albus knew it was there now, knew that Hogwarts held spaces like this throughout its vastness, rooms and passages that opened only for those who paid attention, who listened to what the castle was trying to say. And he knew, with a quiet certainty that would shape the rest of his life, that he had been chosen for something he didn't yet fully understand. The castle had recognized something in him, and in return, he would spend his life recognizing what was in the castle, the memories, the magic, the long continuity of care that stretched back through centuries and would stretch forward through centuries more. He was 12 years old, and he had just become, though he didn't have words for it, yet exactly what the old parchment had named him, a keeper. Not of secrets precisely, but of the small essential things that made Hogwarts more than just a school. The notes left in margins, the light captured in vials, the way the stones grew warm when they recognized someone who cared enough to notice. As Albus walked back toward the library, he really did need that transfiguration book. The castle settled around him with its familiar small sounds, and if the floors beneath his feet felt slightly warmer than usual, if the portraits he passed seemed to watch him with something like approval, well, he was listening now, and Hogwarts, patient as stone and old as magic itself, had all the time in the world to teach him what that meant. The winter of 1938 had settled over Hogwarts with unusual weight. Snow lay thick on the castle's towers, and frost traced delicate patterns across every window by morning. In the staff room on the second floor, a fire burned perpetually, fed by house elves who appeared and disappeared with their characteristic silence. But even its warmth seemed unable to fully dispel the cold that had crept into the castle stones. Albus Dumbledore, now 37, and the recently appointed Transfiguration Professor, stood at the window watching students cross the courtyard below. They moved in their usual clusters, Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws together, Slytherins keeping to themselves more than he remembered from his own school days, Gryffindors loud and laughing despite the cold. Everything looked as it always had. And yet, "The castle is uneasy," said a voice behind him. Albus turned to find Armando Dippet standing in the doorway, looking older than he had even at breakfast. The headmaster had held his position for nearly 2 decades now, and the years showed in the lines around his eyes, the way his robes hung slightly loose on his frame. But it was something else Albus noticed today, a weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue. "Sir," Albus said carefully. Dippet crossed to the fire, holding his hands out to its warmth. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Albus waited with the patience he had learned in that hidden classroom so many years ago. Some things could not be rushed. "How long have you been back at Hogwarts now?" Dippet asked finally. 3 months? "Nearly 4, sir. And in that time, have you noticed anything unusual?" Albus considered his answer. He had noticed many things. The way certain corridors seemed colder than others, though they had no windows to admit drafts. The portraits whispering more than usual, falling silent when staff approached. The house elves moving with a kind of anxious efficiency, as though preparing for something they could sense but not name. "The castle feels watchful," Albus said at last. "More so than I remember." Dippet nodded slowly, unsurprised. "You were always observant, even as a student. Your professors remarked on it. The way you noticed things others missed." He paused, then added, "Your ancestor, had the same quality. The first Albus Dumbledore. He served as deputy headmaster here for 17 years. I didn't know that, Albus said quietly, though something in him had suspected. Those notes in the hidden classroom had carried the weight of authority, of someone who had stayed at Hogwarts long after his school days ended. There are many things about this castle that aren't written in any official history, Dippet said. Things that are passed down differently, from headmaster to deputy, from one generation of staff to the next. Custodial knowledge, we call it. He turned from the fire to look directly at Albus. I think it's time you began learning it. Over the weeks that followed, Dippet began Albus's education in the true keeping of Hogwarts. They walked the castle in the early mornings before breakfast, when the corridors belonged only to ghosts and portraits, and the occasional house elf tending to duties that predated any current staff member's memory. Dippet moved slowly, his footsteps careful on stone that was slick with age and winter frost, and he spoke in the low, measured tones of someone sharing something precious. This section of the 4th floor, he said one morning, running his hand along the wall, was rebuilt after the Goblin Rebellion of 1752. The original stones were damaged beyond repair. But if you stand here, he positioned Albus in a particular spot. You can still feel where the old magic meets the new. The castle remembers the violence done to it, even if the physical scars are gone. Albus stood very still, reaching out with senses he had been developing since he was 12 years old. And yes, there it was, a subtle shift in temperature, a faint vibration in the stone, as though the wall itself carried a memory of breaking and being made whole again. The castle feels everything that happens within it, Dippet continued. Not as we feel things, perhaps, but in its own way. Every spell cast, every charm laid, every moment of joy or fear or sorrow, Hogwarts absorbs it all. Over centuries, that creates a kind of accumulated awareness. They visited the forbidden forest's edge, where ancient wards hummed with power that had nothing to do with any living wizard's magic. Dippet explained how these protections had been laid in layers across generations, each headmaster adding their own contribution, until the boundary between the forest and the castle grounds had become something almost sentient in its ability to recognize threat. The centaurs know, Dippet said, his breath misting in the cold morning air. They've always known. That's why they remain in the forest, why they maintain their own distance. There's an understanding between them and Hogwarts that goes back to the founders themselves. In the dungeons, Dippet showed Albus where the castle's original foundations met bedrock, where the magic of the place ran deepest and oldest. And in the towers, he pointed out windows that showed not just the grounds below, but if you knew how to look, faint echoes of the past, shadows of previous towers, ghosts of architecture that had been replaced or rebuilt across the centuries. Every headmaster learns this, Dippet said as they climbed the stairs to his office one afternoon. Or should. Some grasp it better than others. Some add to the castle's protections with great skill. Others simply maintain what has always been. He paused on the landing, looking tired. I've done my best, but I fear what's coming will require more than maintenance. Albus understood what he meant. Even here, isolated in the castle, they were not untouched by what was happening in the wider wizarding world. Gellert Grindelwald's name appeared in the Daily Prophet with increasing frequency, his influence spreading across Europe like frost across a window. Students arrived each term with haunted looks, speaking carefully of family members who had disappeared or changed their allegiances. The castle, sensitive to such currents, had grown watchful. But there was something else troubling Hogwarts, something more immediate than distant threats. Albus first noticed it in his 3rd month of teaching. A Slytherin prefect, tall and dark-haired and possessed of unusual intelligence, had begun spending significant time alone, wandering corridors that few students had reason to visit. Tom Riddle was brilliant in transfiguration, advancing through the material faster than any student Albus had taught. But there was something in the boy's questions that troubled him. They were always about limits, what magic could and couldn't do, what protections could be circumvented, what rules might be bent without breaking entirely. He's searching for something, Albus told Dippet one evening in the headmaster's office. The sorting hat dozed on its shelf, and the portraits of previous headmasters pretended sleep while listening intently. I'm not certain what, but he moves through the castle as though he's mapping it. Dippet frowned. Riddle, yes, exceptionally talented. The other professors speak highly of him. They do, Albus agreed. And yet, the castle doesn't trust him. It was the first time Albus had spoken this observation aloud, though he had been aware of it for weeks. Certain passages seemed to close ahead of Tom Riddle's movements, not obviously, but in subtle ways. A door that stuck when it shouldn't, stairs that shifted just as he approached, corridors that grew inexplicably cold. Hogwarts was doing what it had always done, protecting itself and its students, but it was doing so against one of its own. Dippet was quiet for a long moment. Then he rose and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened grounds. The castle's judgment is not infallible, he said slowly, but neither is it given lightly. If Hogwarts has reservations about young Riddle— He trailed off, then turned back to Albus. Watch him. Not obviously, but watch him, and tell me what you see. The winter deepened. Albus taught his classes, walked the castle in the early mornings with Dippet, and kept a careful, distant eye on Tom Riddle. The boy was 17 now, in his 6th year, and he had begun gathering followers. Other Slytherins mostly, though a few Ravenclaws as well. They moved through the corridors with a kind of quiet confidence, as though they knew something others didn't, and perhaps they did. One night in February, Albus found himself unable to sleep. The castle was too quiet, too still, as though holding its breath. He rose, wrapped himself in his heaviest robes, and walked the corridors he had come to know so well. The hidden classroom was still there, of course. The wall opened to his touch as it always had, and he descended the worn stairs into the familiar space. Someone had been here since his last visit years ago. New notes covered one of the desks. Observations about charms, theory that looked to be only a few months old. The castle's archive continued, students adding their small contributions to its accumulating memory. But tonight, Albus didn't stop at the classroom. He continued deeper, following a pull he couldn't quite name, until he found himself in a section of the dungeons he had never explored before. The walls here were different, older stone, rougher, less refined. Original construction, perhaps, from the castle's earliest days. And there, carved into the stone with a precision that spoke of powerful magic, were wards he had never seen before. Not protective ones, exactly. More like boundaries, containment, as though something in these depths needed to be kept separate from the rest of the castle. Albus reached out carefully, not touching, just sensing. The magic here was Founder's era. He was certain of it. Salazar Slytherin's work, specifically. He could feel the particular quality of it, the serpentine nature of the protections. Something was sealed here. Something dangerous. And recently, very recently, someone had been testing those seals. The scratches in the stone were fresh, days old at most. Someone had been here, examining the wards, looking for weaknesses. Someone who knew enough about ancient magic to recognize what they were seeing, and who was skilled enough to begin probing for ways through. Albus stood in the cold dungeon darkness for a long time, his wand light casting shadows across the carved wards. Then he turned and made his way back up through the castle to the headmaster's office, where he found Dippet still awake, sitting by his fire. "Sir," Albus said quietly, "I think we need to discuss the Chamber of Secrets." Dippet's face went very still. "What do you know about that?" "Only what's legend. That Salazar Slytherin built a hidden chamber somewhere in the castle before he left. That it contains something dangerous. That the founders sealed it, and it's remained sealed for 1,000 years." Albus paused. "And that someone is currently trying to find it." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. Dippet shared what he knew, which was less than Albus had hoped. The chamber was real, that much was certain. Every headmaster had searched for it at one time or another, none successfully. The castle itself seemed unwilling to reveal its location, as though honoring some ancient agreement with its founders. But the threat it posed had always been theoretical, distant, until now. "If young Riddle has found a way to locate the chamber," Dippet said, his voice heavy with worry, "if he's discovered how to open it, then the castle's unease makes sense," Albus finished. "It knows. It's been trying to warn us." They sat in silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside the window, the first grey light of morning began to touch the castle's towers. Soon the house elves would be lighting fires throughout Hogwarts. Students would wake and dress. Breakfast would appear in the Great Hall. The ordinary rhythms of the school day would continue, as they always had. But something had changed. Albus could feel it in the stone beneath his feet, in the way the portraits around the office had ceased their pretense of sleep and were watching him with ancient, knowing eyes. He had returned to Hogwarts intending to teach, to share his knowledge of transfiguration with students eager to learn. But the castle had other plans for him. It had recognized in him what it had recognized in his ancestor a century before. Someone who could listen, someone who could learn the deeper language of its stones and magic, someone who might be trusted with its oldest secrets and its most profound vulnerabilities. "You'll need to start adding your own protections," Dippet said finally, quietly. "Small ones, at first. The castle will guide you. It always does, for those who truly care for it." Albus nodded slowly. He thought of that hidden classroom, of the notes left by generations of students, of the light captured in vials and the memories held in stone. He thought of his ancestors' words. "The castle keeps what we give it. Choose carefully what you leave behind." He understood now what he would leave behind. Not just notes or observations or small objects hidden beneath floorboards, but his own magic. woven carefully into Hogwarts' ancient protections. His own awareness added to the castle's accumulated consciousness. His own care, given freely to a place that had given him so much. The inheritance Dippet spoke of wasn't just knowledge. It was responsibility. It was becoming part of the long chain of guardians who had protected Hogwarts across the centuries, each adding their own strength to the whole, each learning to hear what the castle was trying to say. Outside, the sun cleared the horizon, and the castle stones began to warm with morning light. Somewhere below, the first students would be stirring. Life would continue, ordinary and extraordinary, magical and mundane. And Albus Dumbledore, 37 years old and newly aware of the weight he had chosen to carry, felt the castle settle around him like a cloak. Not confining, but sheltering. Not demanding, but trusting. He was listening now, as he had promised himself he would all those years ago. And Hogwarts, patient as ever, began to teach him what it truly meant to be a keeper of its secrets. The spring of 1943 arrived late at Hogwarts, reluctant and cold. The snow that had blanketed the grounds since November finally began to melt in March, revealing lawns brown and lifeless, as though the winter had taken something essential from them. In the greenhouses, Professor Beery worked longer hours than usual, coaxing reluctant plants back to life, and even the house elves moved with less than their usual efficiency, as though some vital warmth had gone out of the castle itself. Albus felt it most acutely in the early mornings, during his walks through the empty corridors. The stone beneath his feet remained cold long after sunrise, and the portraits, usually garrulous, eager to gossip about students and staff alike, had grown quiet and watchful. Something was wrong with Hogwarts, something deeper than weather or season could explain. And then, on a grey afternoon in June, a girl died. Myrtle Warren was found in the second-floor girls' bathroom, her body crumpled beside the sinks, her eyes wide and staring at something no one else could see. The official determination was that she had suffered some kind of magical accident, though no one could explain what spell might have caused such a death, or who might have cast it. She had been alone. The bathroom had been empty save for her, except that couldn't be true, because Myrtle Warren had been crying when she died. The ghost, for she had remained, as some witches and wizards did when death came unexpectedly, could remember that much. She had been crying over something another student had said had fled to the bathroom for privacy. And then there was a voice, the ghost told Albus, her spectral form hovering near the sinks where her body had been found. Armando Dippet stood beside him, pale and drawn, looking older than his 70 years. A horrible voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then everything went cold, and I saw, but she couldn't say what she had seen. The memory wouldn't come or couldn't, as though something had severed it at the crucial moment. She dissolved into ghostly tears, and no amount of gentle questioning could bring her back to coherence. The bathroom itself told Albus more. He stood there after Dippet had left, after the students had been cleared from this section of the castle, and he simply listened. The way he had learned to listen over the past 5 years, the way the castle had taught him. The stone here was wrong, not damaged, not cursed, but profoundly disturbed, as though something ancient and terrible had passed through it, leaving a kind of scar in its wake. The pipes that ran through the walls hummed with an unsettled energy, and one of the sinks, the one beneath which Myrtle's body had been found, felt different when Albus rested his hand against its cold porcelain. Old magic, Founders' Era magic, Slytherin's work, unmistakably. He had found the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets. The days that followed were among the darkest Albus had experienced at Hogwarts. The Ministry arrived, officials striding through the corridors with self-important urgency, asking questions to which no one had adequate answers. Parents sent owls demanding their children be sent home. The Board of Governors held emergency meetings, their voices carrying through the castle with increasing panic. And through it all, Tom Riddle moved with careful concern, the perfect prefect, offering assistance to the younger students, expressing sorrow over Myrtle's death, suggesting theories that led the investigation in entirely wrong directions. Albus watched him, watched the way he avoided certain corridors now, the ones that led toward the dungeons and those ancient wards Albus had discovered months ago, watched how he never went near the second-floor bathroom, though as a prefect he might have had a reason to, watched the small, satisfied smile that flickered across his face when he thought no one was looking. He did this, Albus said to Dippet one night in the headmaster's office. I'm certain of it. We have no proof, Dippet replied wearily. He looked exhausted, worn down by ministry pressure and parental complaints and the weight of a death that had occurred under his watch. The boy was nowhere near the bathroom when it happened. Half a dozen students can attest to his location. Then he found a way to open the chamber remotely, or he's controlling whatever creature Slytherin left inside it. Albus leaned forward, urgent. Sir, we must. What? Dippet interrupted. And there was something brittle in his voice, something close to breaking. Accuse the school's most accomplished student of murder based on intuition, on the castle's feelings? You know as well as I do that would never stand. Albus fell silent because Dippet was right. There was no proof. Nothing that would convince the ministry or the board or even the other professors. Only his certainty and the castle's cold, grieving stones and the way Tom Riddle walked through Hogwarts as though he owned it. 3 days later, Riddle produced his evidence. A student named Rubeus Hagrid, a third-year Gryffindor with a known fondness for dangerous creatures, had apparently been keeping an acromantula in the castle. The spider had escaped, had somehow made its way to the second-floor bathroom, had killed Myrtle Warren. It was a tragedy, Riddle explained earnestly to the headmaster. But these things happened when students were irresponsible with dangerous creatures. The evidence was thin, circumstantial, but the ministry was desperate to close the case. The board wanted the school reopened, and Hagrid, terrified and inarticulate, unable to explain how his spider could possibly have caused such a death, was expelled. Albus argued against it, argued with Dippet, with the board, with anyone who would listen. But he was a junior professor, only 5 years at Hogwarts, and his protests were noted and dismissed. The case was closed. Hogwarts would remain open. Tom Riddle received an award for special services to the school for his role in solving the mystery. And Myrtle Warren's ghost took up residence in the bathroom where she had died, crying for the rest of eternity. The night after Hagrid's expulsion, Albus returned to the second-floor bathroom alone. It was past midnight, the castle deep in sleep, only the portraits and ghosts awake to witness his presence there. He stood before the sink that marked the chamber's entrance and pressed his palm against it, feeling the old magic thrumming beneath. He couldn't open it. He had tried, in the days since Myrtle's death, speaking every command he could think of in every language he knew. The chamber required something he didn't possess, some key, some password, some quality that only Slytherin's heir could provide. But he could do something else. Over the years since his return to Hogwarts, Albus had been adding small protections to the castle, as Dippet had instructed. Wards against dark magic in certain corridors, charms of awareness woven into doorways where students were most vulnerable, subtle enchantments that helped the castle watch over those in its care. Now he would add something different, something permanent. He drew his wand slowly, feeling the magic gather at its tip. This would not be dramatic. No flash of light, no sound of power unleashed. The best protections never were. They settled into stone and mortar so gradually that they became indistinguishable from the castle itself. Custodiae perpetuae, he whispered, and began to weave. The spell took hours. He layered it carefully, patiently, binding it not to the entrance of the chamber, but to the castle around it. A ward of attention, he thought of it. Something that would make Hogwarts more aware of this place, more sensitive to any future attempts to open what should remain closed. The chamber itself was beyond his reach, sealed by magic older and stronger than his own. But the approaches to it, the corridors and passages that led here, those he could mark, could teach the castle to watch. It was nearly dawn when he finished. The magic settled into the stone with a sound like a sigh, and Albus felt the castle acknowledge his work with a warmth that spread up through his feet, through his bones, a sense of recognition that was almost like gratitude. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more," he said quietly to the empty bathroom, to Myrtle's ghost sleeping in her stall, to the castle itself. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop what happened." But he could prevent it from happening again, or at least he could make it harder. Make it so that the next time someone tried to open the chamber, Hogwarts itself would know, would resist, would find ways to warn those who were listening. The weeks that followed were strange and subdued. The school year ended early, students sent home 2 weeks ahead of schedule, while the board satisfied itself that the danger had passed. Tom Riddle returned to his orphanage, the Slytherin common room emptied, and Hogwarts settled into the quiet of summer term, with only a handful of students remaining. Albus spent those weeks walking the castle as he had never walked it before, learning its grief. Because Hogwarts was grieving. He could feel it in every stone, every corridor, every room. The castle had failed to protect one of its students, and that failure had left a wound that would not quickly heal. Portraits wept openly. Ghosts moved through the halls with unusual solemnity. Even Peeves subdued and quiet. The house elves went about their duties with none of their usual cheer, and the very air felt heavy with loss. In the headmaster's office one evening, Albus found the Sorting Hat awake and unusually talkative. "I saw into that boy's mind," the Hat said without preamble. "When he was 11, when I sat upon his head for the sorting, I saw things that troubled me even then." "Why didn't you say anything?" Albus asked, though he already knew the answer. "What could I say? That I sensed darkness in an 11-year-old child, that I feared what he might become." The Hat's voice was bitter, with something that might have been regret. I am meant to sort students, not condemn them for what they haven't yet done. I placed him in Slytherin because that was where he belonged, where his qualities would be most at home. But I warned him in our private conversation. I told him that greatness and goodness are not the same thing. He didn't listen. No, the hat agreed quietly. He did not. They sat in silence for a while, Albus in Dippet's chair. The headmaster was away at a board meeting, and the hat on its shelf, both contemplating the weight of choices made and their terrible consequences. "What will you do now?" the hat asked finally. "Watch," Albus said. "Wait, add what protections I can." He paused, then added, "Hope that when Riddle returns, the castle is ready for him. And if he doesn't return, if he's finished with Hogwarts?" But they both knew he wasn't finished. Whatever Tom Riddle had been seeking in the Chamber of Secrets, whatever he had learned from opening it, had merely been a beginning. The castle knew it, the hat knew it, and Albus knew it with a certainty that made his chest tight with dread. Summer gave way to autumn, and students returned for a new school year. The second-floor bathroom remained closed, Myrtle's ghost guarding it with her tears. The ministry had moved on to other concerns. The board had declared the matter resolved, and slowly, gradually, Hogwarts began to heal. But it didn't forget. Albus could feel the difference in the castle now, a new quality to its awareness. Where before it had been patient and observant, now it was watchful and wary. The protections he had laid around the chamber's entrance had become part of its consciousness, and Hogwarts had learned from them, had begun extending similar awareness to other vulnerable places. Passages shifted more frequently, doors locked that had previously stood open. The castle had lost some essential trust, and it would not regain it easily. In the hidden classroom that only opened for those who listened, Albus added new notes to his desk. The castle feels grief the way we do, deeply, permanently, in ways that change its fundamental nature. Myrtle Warren died today, and Hogwarts will carry that death in its stones forever. I've added protections, but they feel insufficient. The true danger isn't what was sealed in the chamber. It's what walked away from it, unpunished and uncaught. I'm beginning to understand what my ancestor meant about being a keeper. It's not just about preserving what's good in this place. It's about standing guard against what would harm it, even when, especially when, that harm comes from within. He sat there for a long time after writing those words, the classroom silent around him, the desks holding their accumulated archive of generations. The castle had chosen him for this role, had recognized in him the capacity to be what it needed. Not just a teacher, not just a guardian of knowledge, but something more fundamental. A keeper of its secrets, yes, but also a keeper of its sorrows, a witness to its wounds. Someone who would remember what others wanted to forget, who would remain watchful long after everyone else had looked away. Tom Riddle had graduated and left Hogwarts, but Albus would remain, would continue adding his small protections, his careful wards, his patient attention to the castle's needs. Would be here if, when, Riddle returned. The castle had taught him to listen. Now it was teaching him to wait. And Albus Dumbledore, 42 years old and newly aware of the long game he was playing, settled into the patience of stone itself. Because that was what keepers did. They remained. They watched. They protected what mattered across years and decades and centuries. One small ward at a time, One careful spell, one moment of attention given freely to a place that had given them everything. Outside the hidden classroom, Hogwarts breathed through its corridors with the steady rhythm of deep magic. Grieving, yes. Wounded, yes. But enduring, as it always had, as it always would. And Albus, listening in the darkness, heard its promise to endure, and added his own promise in return. He would be here, however long it took, whatever came next. The summer of 1967 settled over Hogwarts with unexpected gentleness. The grounds bloomed in waves of colour, wildflowers in the meadows beyond the greenhouses, roses climbing the castle's south wall, the beech tree by the lake heavy with new leaves that whispered in the warm breeze. After years of tension, of wars both magical and muggle, of darkness gathering and dispersing and gathering again, this season felt like an earned respite. Albus Dumbledore, now headmaster for 6 years, stood at the window of his office watching the sun set over the forbidden forest. The light turned everything golden. The towers, the lake, even the forest itself seemed touched by grace. Fawkes dozed on his perch, occasionally releasing a soft trill in his sleep. The portraits of previous headmasters murmured quietly to one another, and the sorting hat hummed a fragment of some centuries-old tune. This was peace, fragile, temporary perhaps, but real. Behind him, the door opened with a soft knock that had preceded it by barely a second. "You wanted to see me, headmaster," said Professor McGonagall, and Albus turned to find his deputy standing in the doorway, her usual briskness softened slightly by the evening light. "Minerva, yes, thank you for coming." He gestured to the chair before his desk. "Tea?" She nodded, and he poured from the pot that had appeared. House elf magic, quiet and efficient as always. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two colleagues who had worked together long enough to understand that not every conversation required immediate speech. "I wanted to discuss the castle," Albus said finally. "Its particular needs." Minerva's eyebrow rose slightly. "Go on. You've been here, 12 years now? First as a teacher, now as deputy. In that time, have you noticed anything unusual about Hogwarts itself? Beyond the ordinary magic, I mean." She considered this, her sharp mind visibly working through observations she had perhaps never quite put into words. "The stairs shift more for some students than others," she said slowly. "Not randomly. Almost as though they're being helpful. And certain rooms, the abandoned classroom on the 4th floor, for instance, seem to appear and disappear depending on who's looking for them." "Exactly so." Albus leaned back in his chair, pleased. "The castle is aware, Minerva. Not sentient in the way you and I are, but aware nonetheless. It responds to need, to intention, to the accumulated care of generations, and it requires tending. Over the next hour, as the summer twilight deepened into night, Albus shared with Minerva what Armando Dippet had once shared with him, the custodial knowledge that passed from headmaster to deputy, the understanding of Hogwarts not just as a building, but as a living presence that required attention and protection and care. He didn't share everything. Some things, the Chamber of Secrets, certain wards he had placed after Myrtle Warren's death, his suspicions about Tom Riddle, those he kept to himself. But he shared enough. The basics of how to listen to what the castle was saying, how to recognize when protections needed reinforcement, how to work with Hogwarts rather than simply within it. "Why tell me this now?" Minerva asked when he had finished. because the burden shouldn't rest with one person alone, Albus said simply. I learned that too late. Tippett carried too much by himself, and it diminished him, I think. Made him unable to act when action was most needed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I would not make the same mistake. Something shifted in Minerva's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. I see, she said quietly. Then I'll begin paying closer attention. Thank you, Minerva. That's all I ask. The years that followed established rhythms that would define Albus's headmastership. He walked the castle each morning before breakfast, a practice he had maintained since his teaching days. But now he did so with deeper purpose. These walks were conversations, in their way, his attention given freely to Hogwarts, and the castle's responses felt through stone and magic and the subtle shifts in atmosphere that only long familiarity could detect. He consulted with the sorting hat regularly, often late at night when the office was quiet and the portraits dozed. The hat had become something of a confidant over the years, its 1,000 years of experience with student nature providing perspective that no living wizard could match. House dynamics shift like tides, the hat observed one autumn evening. Currently, Slytherin has grown insular. Not dangerously so, not yet, but they're withdrawing from the other houses more than is healthy. What would you recommend? Albus asked, genuinely curious. More inter-house activities. Practical ones, not just Quidditch. Pair students across house lines for certain projects. Let them discover they have more in common than they think. The hat paused, then added, and watch the Slytherin prefects. They set the tone for the younger students. Choose carefully who wears that badge. Albus took the advice. Over the following terms, he quietly implemented changes, more collaborative projects, updated prefect selection criteria, subtle encouragements for inter-house friendships. The effects were gradual but real. The 4 houses remained distinct, as they should, but the walls between them grew more permeable. The ghost, too, became part of his network of attention. They moved through Hogwarts with a freedom the living couldn't match, passing through walls and floors, present in every corner of the castle simultaneously, it sometimes seemed. And they noticed things. There's a first-year Ravenclaw who cries in the astronomy tower most nights, the Grey Lady told him one December evening, her translucent form hovering near his office window. She's homesick, I think, but too proud to admit it. Albus made a note to speak with Professor Flitwick to ensure the girl received appropriate pastoral care. These small interventions were part of his work, now facilitated by the castle itself, by the network of awareness he had been carefully building. Even Peeves, chaotic and mischievous as he was, could be bargained with. I'll stop dropping water balloons on prefects, the poltergeist agreed one memorable afternoon. If you convince the house elves to leave out better snacks in the kitchens, the current biscuits are stale. Peeves, the house elves' biscuits are never stale. Well, they're not chaotic enough. I want ones that explode into confetti. They negotiated. Peeves got his confetti biscuits, limited to specific occasions. The prefects got a respite from water balloons, at least on weekdays. It was a small victory, but Albus had learned that keeping Hogwarts running smoothly often meant accumulating many small victories rather than seeking grand solutions. The house elves, of course, were the true keepers of Hogwarts' daily rhythms. They had been here longer than any wizard, serving the castle with a devotion that predated the founders themselves. Albus made it a practice to visit the kitchens regularly, not to supervise, but to listen. The castle's been quiet this week. An elderly elf named Mimsy told him one evening, her voice carrying the particular authority of 7 decades service. Content like, the students is happy, mostly. Good for the stones when students is happy. And when they're not happy, Albus asked gently. The stones remember, sir. Everything gets remembered. Happy things and sad things both. She looked up at him with enormous eyes. That's why we keeps the fires burning steady, and the blankets warm, and the food good. Small comforts helps when the stones is remembering sad things. It was perhaps the most profound statement about Hogwarts nature that Albus had ever heard. Small comforts against accumulated sorrow, daily care against the weight of history. The house elves understood instinctively what he'd taken decades to learn. That tending to Hogwarts meant tending to both its physical needs and its emotional memory. In 1971, a new generation of students arrived. Among them were 4 boys who would become legendary in their own time, though for now they were simply first years finding their way. Albus watched James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew sort into Gryffindor, watched them begin forming the bonds that would define their school years, and felt the castle respond to their particular energy with something that might have been amusement. The castle had always liked troublemakers, he had noticed, not malicious ones, but the clever, creative sort who pushed boundaries without malice. These 4 would test limits, certainly, but they would also, in their way, add to Hogwarts' accumulating story. Every generation did. He paid special attention to young Lupin, whose lycanthropy Albus had learned of before the boy's first term. This required delicate handling, protections that would keep everyone safe while preserving the boy's dignity and his chance at a normal education. Albus spent weeks preparing the Shrieking Shack, establishing a secure path through the Whomping Willow, laying wards that would contain a werewolf without making the place feel like a prison. The castle approved, in its way. The willow's branches swayed with particular vigor once the protections were complete, and the tunnel that led to the shack developed a subtle warmth, as though Hogwarts itself was trying to make the space less frightening for a terrified child. One autumn evening in their 3rd year, Albus discovered something unexpected. He was walking the 7th floor corridor, his mind on other matters, when a door appeared in the wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy. He had been thinking about Remus, about how isolated the boy sometimes seemed despite his friendships, about how Hogwarts might help. The Room of Requirement. Of course, he had heard rumors of it, references in old texts, but had never quite managed to find it himself. Now here it was, responding not to his search, but to his need to understand how Hogwarts could better care for its students. He stepped inside and found himself in a library unlike any other, filled with books about pastoral care, about helping students with extraordinary challenges, about the history of how Hogwarts had accommodated unusual needs across the centuries. The room had provided exactly what he required, not what he had asked for. Over the following weeks, Albus experimented carefully. The room appeared for genuine need, but not for curiosity alone. It responded to desperation, to creativity, to the kind of focused intention that came from truly caring about solving a problem, and it was generous in its interpretations, sometimes providing solutions the seeker hadn't even considered. This was Hogwarts' true magic, Albus realized, not in its grand protections or ancient wards, but in its responsiveness to those who truly needed help. The castle had been doing this for 1,000 years, shifting stairs to help lost students, warming rooms for those who were cold, providing spaces for those who required privacy or safety, or simply a place to think. His role as headmaster then was not to control this magic, but to facilitate it, to keep the channels clear, to ensure the castle's awareness remained sharp, to add protections where they were needed, while trusting Hogwarts to do what it had always done. In his office one night, he shared this realization with the portrait of Armando Dippet. "You're learning what I never quite mastered," the portrait said approvingly. "Partnership with the castle, rather than stewardship over it. Well done, Albus." "I had a good teacher," Albus replied, and meant it. The 1970s passed with their mix of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. Students came and went, each leaving their small mark on Hogwarts stones. Some graduates went on to greatness, others to quiet lives, a few to darkness. Albus watched them all, trying to guide where he could, knowing he would not always succeed. In the hidden classroom that had been his refuge since childhood, he continued adding notes to the desk his ancestor had used, maintaining the tradition that stretched back centuries. The castle teaches patience. Every protection takes time to settle properly into the stones. Every relationship requires cultivation. There are no quick solutions here, only accumulated care. The house elves understand this better than any wizard. Small comforts, daily attention, steady warmth against the cold. That's how you tend to a living place. I've been headmaster for 15 years now, and I'm still learning to listen, still discovering what Hogwarts needs, what it's trying to say. Perhaps that's the point. There's no moment when you've learned enough. The castle grows, changes, responds to new generations. A keeper must grow and change with it. He sat back, looking at the accumulated notes that covered the desk's surface, generations of observations layered one atop another. His ancestor had been right all those years ago. The castle kept what you gave it. Every small protection, every moment of attention, every act of care, all of it woven into Hogwarts' fabric, becoming part of its eternal presence. Outside the hidden classroom, the castle breathed with the gentle rhythm of deep summer. Students slept in their dormitories. House elves tended fires that needed no tending. Portraits gossiped in the quiet hours, and ghosts drifted through corridors on errands only they understood. And Albus Dumbledore, 66 years old and still learning, felt the weight of his guardianship settle around him like the castle itself, not confining, but encompassing. He had chosen this burden decades ago. That day he first touched the wall on the 4th floor and felt it warm beneath his hand. Now it was simply part of who he was. Not headmaster only, not teacher or scholar or wizard, but keeper, guardian, a voice in the long conversation between Hogwarts and those who loved it enough to listen. The castle had chosen well, he thought, and he had chosen well in return. They would continue this partnership, this patient tending, for as long as he was able. And when his time came to join the portraits on the office walls, someone else would take up the burden, would add their own protections and observations and care. That was how Hogwarts endured. not through any single guardian, but through the accumulated devotion of everyone who had ever loved it enough to stay, to watch, to listen, to keep. The winter of 1996 arrived at Hogwarts with a peculiar brittleness. Ice formed in patterns too geometric to be natural. Frost crept across windows in straight lines rather than organic fractals, and the very air seemed to hold itself rigid, as though the castle was bracing against something it could sense but not yet see. Albus felt it most keenly in the early mornings, when he made his customary walks through the corridors and found the stones colder than winter alone could explain. Something was coming, or rather, something had already arrived, wearing the face of authority and speaking in the honeyed tones of institutional reform. Dolores Umbridge had been at Hogwarts for 3 months now, appointed by the Ministry as High Inquisitor, with powers that superseded even the headmaster's traditional authority. She wore pink, smiled constantly, and issued educational decrees with the regularity of a clock striking hours. And everywhere she went, Hogwarts recoiled. Albus noticed it first in small ways. Doors that opened smoothly for every other professor required extra force when Umbridge approached them. Stairs shifted more frequently on her routes, adding unnecessary minutes to her journeys between classrooms. The portraits fell silent when she passed, their occupants turning their painted backs or simply vanishing from their frames until she had gone. The castle was resisting. Educational Decree Number 24, Umbridge announced at a staff meeting in November, her voice saccharine and implacable. All student organizations are hereby disbanded. Any student wishing to reform a group must seek approval from the High Inquisitor's office. Albus said nothing, though he felt Minerva stiffen beside him. Around the staff table, the other professors maintained careful neutrality, their faces revealing nothing. They had learned over the past months that open disagreement only provoked more restrictive decrees. But later, walking the 7th floor corridor alone, Albus felt the castle's response. Where the room of requirement had once revealed itself readily, now the wall remained stubbornly solid. He paced 3 times, thinking of the room's many configurations, but nothing appeared. Hogwarts had sealed the room away, hidden it so thoroughly that even he could not access it. Protecting it, Albus realized, protecting the space where students might gather beyond the reach of educational decrees and pink-clad authority. The castle knew what it was doing. Over the following weeks, Hogwarts' resistance became more pronounced. Albus catalogued the small rebellions with something close to pride. The astronomy tower's stairs developed a tendency to form extra steps when Umbridge climbed them, leaving her breathless and irritated. The faculty bathroom's door refused to unlock for her, forcing her to use student facilities. Even Peeves, usually indiscriminate in his chaos, seemed to target her specifically. Water balloons dropped at precisely the moment she passed beneath doorways, chalk dust falling from non-existent sources to powder her pink cardigans. "The poltergeist is out of control," Umbridge complained at yet another staff meeting, her toad-like face pinched with fury. "Headmaster, you must do something." "Peeves has never been controllable, Dolores," Albus replied mildly. "That is rather his defining characteristic. What he didn't say was that Peeves answered to Hogwarts itself, had been part of the castle's fabric for centuries, and was currently doing exactly what the castle wanted him to do. The poltergeist's harassment of Umbridge wasn't random chaos. It was targeted, purposeful. a manifestation of the castle's own displeasure. In December, Umbridge began inspecting lessons. She sat in classrooms with her clipboard and her fake smile, making notes while professors taught, asking pointed questions designed to undermine their authority. Most of the staff endured it with gritted teeth, but the castle itself seemed less willing to cooperate. During one of Umbridge's inspections of Professor Flitwick's charms class, the classroom's chandelier began to sway ominously, crystals tinkling with increasing agitation until Umbridge was forced to cut short her visit, ducking nervously as the fixture swung in wider and wider arcs. The moment she left, the chandelier settled back into perfect stillness. In Professor Sinistra's astronomy class, the telescope Umbridge attempted to use somehow developed a fault that left her eye ringed with black, as though she'd been punched. No amount of cleaning charms could remove the mark for 3 days. And in the library, where Umbridge went to inspect Madame Pince's cataloguing system, books flew from shelves with enough force to create genuine danger. Umbridge retreated, pink-faced and furious, while the books settled back into place the moment she'd gone, perfectly alphabetized and entirely innocent. The castle is fighting back, Minerva observed one evening in Albus's office. She stood by the window, watching snow fall across the grounds, her expression caught between approval and concern. I've never seen it so active. Hogwarts has endured many threats over the centuries, Albus said quietly, but usually from outside its walls, an internal threat, someone wearing the guise of legitimate authority, someone who cannot simply be expelled or refused entry. He trailed off, watching Fawkes preen his feathers with unusual agitation. The castle is doing what I cannot do openly. It's protecting its students the only way it knows how. What troubled Albus most was not Umbridge's increasing restrictions, though those were concerning enough, but the way her presence was affecting Hogwarts' fundamental nature. The castle had always been a place of safety, of welcome, of home. Now it felt watchful in an unhealthy way, suspicious, its stones carrying a tension that even the youngest students could sense. The house elves felt it acutely. Albus visited the kitchens one night in January to find them working with none of their usual chatter, their movements efficient but joyless. "The castle is hurting, sir," said Mimsy, her enormous eyes reflecting firelight. "The stones is cold, even with all the fires burning. That pink lady, she's making everything wrong." "I know," Albus said gently. "But Hogwarts is strong. It survived, worse than Dolores Umbridge." "Has it, though?" Mimsy asked. And there was such doubt in her ancient voice that Albus had no immediate answer. In February, Umbridge was appointed headmistress by ministry decree. Albus, facing arrest on fabricated charges, chose to leave rather than fight openly, a calculated retreat that pained him more than he had anticipated. As he prepared to depart from his office for what might be the last time, he felt the castle's confusion, like a physical ache. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the stones, to the portraits watching him with ancient eyes, to Hogwarts itself. "But I can protect you better from outside just now. Trust me." He left in the night, Fawkes accompanying him in a burst of flame, and behind him, Hogwarts settled into a kind of mourning. The portraits told him later, when he could safely communicate with them, that every frame in the castle had felt his departure, like a wound, a sudden absence where his presence had been for more than 50 years. But Albus had one more protection to offer, even in absence. Before leaving, he had walked to the 7th floor corridor one final time. The room of requirement remained hidden, sealed away by the castle's own protective instinct. But Albus had spent decades learning Hogwarts language, understanding its patterns. He pressed his hand against the wall where the door should be and whispered a single request. Protect them, especially those who will need you most. Don't reveal yourself to her, but for the students who truly need sanctuary, be there, as you have always been. The wall warmed beneath his palm, and Albus knew the castle had understood. The room would remain hidden from Umbridge's inspections, from her educational decrees, from her institutional authority, but for students in genuine need, for those who required a place to learn what they were no longer being taught, who needed refuge from an increasingly hostile environment. The room would respond. From his exile, Albus watched through portrait networks and messenger spells as Hogwarts continued its resistance. Umbridge's office door developed a tendency to jam at inconvenient moments. Her new proclamations, mounted on the walls in gilded frames, fell with suspicious regularity, the frames somehow developing faults that sent glass and wood crashing to the floor. Even the suits of armor seemed to shift positions overnight, creating obstacle courses in corridors Umbridge used most frequently. And in the room of requirement, which Umbridge still hadn't located despite increasingly frantic searches, students gathered to learn defense against the dark arts as it should be taught. The portraits reported this to Albus with quiet satisfaction. The castle had found a way to circumvent authority without directly confronting it, had created a space where genuine education could continue despite institutional opposition. The castle remembers what education is supposed to be. Phineas Nigellus Black's portrait observed one night, his painted voice carrying to Albus through the portrait network. Umbridge can issue all the decrees she wants, but she cannot make Hogwarts forget its purpose. In March, the house elves reported something new. The castle's ambient magic, the gentle warmth that usually suffused its stones, the sense of welcome that greeted everyone who entered, had begun withdrawing from certain areas. Specifically, from the corridors and classrooms Umbridge used most frequently. Those spaces grew steadily colder, the stones more hostile, until even the students noticed and began avoiding them when possible. It's like the castle is shunning her, Minerva reported through a portrait, wonder in her voice. Hogwarts has decided she's unwelcome, and it's making that absolutely clear. Albus found this both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it showed Hogwarts' fundamental resilience, its ability to maintain its essential character despite Umbridge's presence. Troubling because such active resistance required enormous magical energy, and he worried about what it might cost the castle in the long term. In April, matters came to a head. Umbridge, frustrated by the castle's constant obstruction, attempted to use Veritaserum on a student. The castle's response was immediate and unmistakable. Every door in her vicinity slammed shut simultaneously. Windows rattled in their frames. The temperature in her office dropped so precipitously that her breath misted in the air, and frost formed patterns on the walls that spelled out words in Old English, ancient prohibitions against the use of certain magics within Hogwarts walls. The portraits reported that Umbridge had gone pale, had fled her office, and not returned for 2 days. And when she did return, She moved through the corridors with visible wariness, as though waiting for the castle to strike again. Hogwarts has marked boundaries she cannot cross, Albus observed, watching through Phineas Nigellus's painted eyes. It cannot remove her. That's beyond its power when she carries ministry authority. But it can limit what she's able to do within its walls. In his absence, the castle had become both his replacement and his continuation. Every protection he had laid over decades of guardianship had activated, layered defenses rising to meet a threat he had anticipated but hoped would never materialize. The wards against dark magic, the charms of awareness, the careful attention woven into doorways and corridors, all of it working together to protect students from someone who wore authority like a weapon. Late one night in May, Albus received a message through the portrait network. Minerva's painted voice, urgent and low. The students have been discovered. Umbridge knows about their defense group. She's taking action. What followed was chaos. Students scattered, some caught, others fleeing through corridors that shifted helpfully to block pursuit. The room of requirements sealed itself so thoroughly that Umbridge couldn't even find the wall where it should be. And throughout it all, Hogwarts itself seemed to hum with protective energy, stairs moving to help students escape, doors unlocking to provide alternative routes, even the portraits calling out warnings and misdirections to confuse Umbridge and her inquisitorial squad. By morning, most of the students had evaded capture. A few had been caught, but their punishment was limited by forces Umbridge didn't understand. Every time she attempted to inflict serious harm, something in the castle prevented it. Quills broke before they could draw blood. Detention rooms locked from the inside, trapping Umbridge outside instead of students within. Even her inquisitorial squad seemed prone to accidents, tripping over perfectly level floors, finding themselves locked in broom cupboards they'd entered willingly. The castle has taken sides, Phineas Nigellus reported, and there was something almost like awe in his painted voice. I've been here as a portrait for decades, and I've never seen Hogwarts assert itself so clearly. It's chosen its students over institutional authority. That's unprecedented. But Albus understood it wasn't unprecedented at all. Hogwarts had always chosen its students, had always prioritized their safety and growth over any external agenda. That was its nature, its purpose, woven into its foundations by the founders themselves. Umbridge had simply created circumstances extreme enough to force that loyalty into visible action. In June, Albus returned. The circumstances of his return were complex, involving ministry politics and evidence that cleared his name. But the moment that mattered most was when he stepped back through Hogwarts' entrance, feeling the castle recognize his presence with a warmth that flooded through the stones. "Welcome home, sir," Minerva said simply, and there were tears in her eyes. That night, alone in his office while portraits slept and Fawkes dozed peacefully, Albus walked the castle as he had not walked it in months. Everywhere he went, he felt Hogwarts settling, tension releasing, the stones growing warmer beneath his feet. The castle had held firm in his absence, had protected its students with every resource at its command. But it was tired now, worn down by months of constant resistance. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty corridors, to the sleeping portraits, to the castle itself. "You did magnificently. You are everything I could not be." In the hidden classroom, he added a new note to his desk, his hand shaking slightly with emotion. The castle can endure without its headmaster, but it shouldn't have to. Hogwarts is strongest when guardianship is shared, when staff, students, portraits, ghosts, house elves, and the castle itself all work together to maintain what matters. I should have trusted that collaboration more fully instead of bearing so much alone. Umbridge is gone now, her authority revoked, but the memory of her presence will remain in these stones for a long time. The castle has been wounded, not physically, but in some essential way, by having to fight against someone who held legitimate power within its walls. It will take time to heal, and I will be here, however long healing takes. That's what keepers do. They remain. The autumn of 1996 arrived with a quality of light that reminded Albus of endings. Golden, yes, but with an edge of melancholy that settled over the castle like morning mist. He stood at his office window on the first day of term, watching students cross the courtyard below. Their faces younger each year, it seemed, or perhaps he was simply growing older, and felt the weight of knowledge that had become increasingly difficult to bear. His hand ached, not the dull throb of arthritis or age, but something deeper, more fundamental. The curse Voldemort had placed on the ring had blackened his fingers, withered the flesh despite Severus's considerable skill in containing it. The damage was irreversible. The curse's progression merely slowed. He had perhaps a year, perhaps less. "You're contemplating mortality again," observed the portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black, not unkindly. "Your expression becomes remarkably transparent when you do." "I'm contemplating preparation," Albus corrected gently. "There's a difference." But Phineas was right, of course. For the first time in more than a century of life, Albus was facing the certainty of his own death with full awareness of its approach. And with that awareness came responsibility, not just to those who would grieve him, but to Hogwarts itself, which had been his partner, his charge, his home for 70 years. The castle needed to be ready to continue without him. He began that very day, though subtly. His morning walks through the corridors took on new purpose, not just checking, observing, maintaining as he had done for decades, but memorizing. Every stone, every passage, every corner where students gathered or ghosts lingered or portraits gossiped. He was saying goodbye, though he did not yet frame it that way, even to himself. In the room of requirement, which now opened readily to his presence after its months of protective concealment, Albus spent hours working through what needed to be done. The room provided what he needed without being asked. Maps of the castle showing ward placements, old texts on defensive magic, even parchment and quills that seemed to understand the gravity of what he was recording. He documented everything. The location of every protection he had laid over the decades, instructions for their maintenance, contingencies should they fail, the passwords to portrait networks, the proper way to negotiate with Peeves, the house elves' traditional hierarchies, and whom to consult for what needs. The hidden passages he had discovered, the rooms that opened only to certain people, the ways in which Hogwarts communicated its needs to those patient enough to listen. "This is a manual for guardianship," he murmured one evening, looking at the accumulated parchment. "Everything I wish I had known when I first became headmaster, and everything I've learned since. Who will read it? asked the Sorting Hat, which had accompanied him to the room that evening. The hat rarely left the office, but for this task it had insisted on being present. Minerva, certainly. She'll be headmistress after me. Albus paused, considering. But it should be available to others as well, future headmasters, future keepers. The castle chooses its own, as you well know. As I do know, the hat agreed softly. I chose you for Gryffindor when you were 11, though you had qualities that would have suited every house. You had courage, yes, but also Ravenclaw's wisdom, Hufflepuff's loyalty, even Slytherin's cunning. But what you had most of all was care. That's what made you a keeper, the capacity to care deeply about something beyond yourself. Albus was quiet for a long moment, touched in ways he had not expected. Thank you, he said finally. That means more than you might know. In October, he began reinforcing certain wards that had grown thin over the years, not dramatically, not with the flash and power that drew attention, but with the patient, accumulating magic he had learned from Hogwarts itself. Layer upon layer, settled carefully into stone, until the protections were so deeply woven they would outlast any single guardian. He focused particularly on the entrances, the main gates, the hidden passages that connected Hogwarts to Hogsmeade, the points where the wards met the boundaries of the grounds. These were places of vulnerability, where external threats could breach the castle's defenses if they found the right weaknesses. I'm making it harder to get in, he explained to Minerva one evening as they walked the perimeter together. But also harder to leave, if necessary. In times of siege, Hogwarts should be able to seal itself entirely, become a fortress that protects everyone within. You're preparing for war, Minerva said quietly. I'm preparing for the possibility of war. There's a difference. He paused at one of the castle's outer walls, pressing his palm against the stone. But yes, Tom Riddle will come for Hogwarts eventually. He has unfinished business here, with the castle, with me, with everything this place represents. And when he comes, I may not be here to stand against him. Minerva's expression tightened, but she didn't argue. She had known him long enough to recognize certainty when she heard it. In November, Albus had conversations he had been avoiding. First with the portraits, gathering them in his office one evening when the castle was quiet and students were safely in their dormitories. I need you to be ready, he told them without preamble. Not just to observe and advise as you've always done, but to act when I'm gone, and I will be gone sooner than any of us would prefer. You'll be the castle's memory, its institutional knowledge. You'll need to guide whoever comes after me. The portraits murmured among themselves, some distressed, others thoughtful. Dilys Derwent spoke first, her painted voice steady. We've been doing this for centuries, Albus. Headmasters come and go. We remain. But you've never had to do it during a war of this magnitude, Albus replied. And you've never had to do it when Voldemort himself might walk these corridors. You'll need to be strategic, hide information when necessary, guide without revealing too much, protect the castle's secrets even, especially, from those who seem to have legitimate authority to know them. He saw understanding dawn across painted faces. They had lived through wars before, had advised headmasters through crises, but this would be different. This would require them to be not just counselors, but guardians in their own right. We understand, said Armando Dippett's portrait quietly. "We'll be ready." The ghosts required different conversations. Albus found them in their usual haunts: the Grey Lady in the Ravenclaw Tower, the Fat Friar in the Great Hall, the Bloody Baron in the dungeons, and even Peeves, lurking near the trophy room with unusual solemnity. "The castle will need you to be more than echoes," Albus told them. "You move through Hogwarts in ways the living cannot. You see things, hear things, notice what others miss. In the times ahead, that awareness will be crucial." "You're asking us to spy," the Bloody Baron observed, his chains clinking softly. "I'm asking you to watch over the students, as you've always done, but with more purpose, more urgency." Albus paused. "And I'm asking you to remember that you're part of Hogwarts' defenses, not just its inhabitants. You can't die again, which makes you uniquely positioned to take risks the living cannot." The Grey Lady drifted closer, her translucent form shimmering in the torchlight. "You're dying," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes. Then we will honor your memory by protecting what you loved." She looked at the other ghosts, and Albus saw them nod in agreement. "The castle will not fall while we remain. You have our word." In December, the snow came early and heavy, blanketing the grounds in white that seemed to muffle sound, to create a pocket of stillness around the castle. Albus used this time to walk Hogwarts more extensively than he had in years, visiting corners he had not seen in decades, reacquainting himself with the fullness of the place. He found the hidden classroom unchanged, his desk still bearing the accumulated notes of his lifetime and his ancestors. He sat there for a long time, reading through observations made when he was 12, 20, 40, 60, a life spent in conversation with stone and magic, with a castle that had become more real to him than most living things. He added one more note, his handwriting shakier now but still clear. "If you're reading this, you found your way here as I did, as my ancestor did, as others have across the centuries. The castle has chosen you. Honor that choice by listening, not just with your ears, but with everything you are." Hogwarts speaks in subtle ways, through warmth and cold, through doors that open and close, through the behavior of portraits and ghosts and house elves. Pay attention. The castle will teach you everything you need to know, but only if you're willing to learn. I've spent 70 years here, and I'm still learning. That's not failure. That's the point. Hogwarts is alive in ways we barely understand, growing and changing with each generation. Your job isn't to master it, but to partner with it, to add your own protections to those that came before, to care for it as it cares for those within its walls. I'm leaving soon, not by choice, but inevitably. I've done what I can to prepare the castle for what's coming. Now, it's your turn. Be worthy of what Hogwarts has given you. Albus Dumbledore, 1996. In January, Albus did something he had not done in decades. He visited the Chamber of Secrets. Not physically. He still could not open it, still lacked the parcel-tongue required. But he stood in that second-floor bathroom where Myrtle Warren's ghost still wept, and he reinforced every ward he had placed there more than 50 years ago. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more for you then," he told Myrtle's ghost gently. "And I'm sorry I cannot undo what was done, but I can ensure it doesn't happen again. That's worth something, isn't it?" Myrtle looked at him with her enormous spectral eyes, and for a moment, her crying ceased. "You've always been kind to me," she said quietly. "Not many people are. You deserved better than what happened to you, Albus replied. Hogwarts remembers that. I want you to know that it remembers and grieves and has never forgotten. The wards he laid that day were the strongest he had ever created, not to seal the chamber, which remained beyond his ability to access, but to alert the castle if anyone ever attempted to open it again. Hogwarts itself would know, would feel the disturbance, would respond with every protective instinct it possessed. By February, his hand had blackened to the wrist, the curse's progression visible despite Severus's best efforts. Albus could feel his strength waning, not dramatically but steadily, like sand running through an hourglass. He had months now, perhaps, certainly not years. He spent more time with the Sorting Hat, having conversations that ranged across centuries of Hogwarts history, across philosophies of education and guardianship and care. You'll need to guide the next headmaster, Albus said one evening. Minerva is brilliant, but she'll need support. She'll need reminding that Hogwarts is more than an institution. It's a living presence that requires partnership. She already knows that, the Hat replied. She's been watching you for decades, learning from you, even when you didn't realize you were teaching. Still, the burdens of leadership can make one forget. Remind her to listen. Remind her to walk the corridors in the early morning. Remind her that the castle speaks to those who pay attention. I will, the Hat promised. And Albus, thank you for everything you've done for this place, for understanding what it means to be a keeper. In March, Albus walked to the astronomy tower, the tallest point of the castle, the place where one could see furthest. He stood there in the cold wind, looking out over the grounds that had been his world for so long, and felt Hogwarts settle around him with something that felt remarkably like affection. I'll miss this, he said quietly to the stones, to the wind, to the castle itself. I'll miss you. The tower's stones warmed beneath his feet, and Albus knew Hogwarts understood. They were saying goodbye, in the way that old partners did when time grew short, with gratitude, with love, with the shared knowledge of decades spent in collaboration and care. Below him, the castle spread out in all its complexity, towers and courtyards, corridors and classrooms, secrets and stories accumulated across 1,000 years. He had added his own stories to that accumulation, had woven his own protections into those ancient stones. And now those protections would remain, would continue long after he was gone, part of Hogwarts' eternal presence. You'll be all right, he told the castle, told himself. You've survived worse than what's coming. You'll survive this too. In his office that night, surrounded by sleeping portraits and the soft sound of Fawkes's breathing, Albus completed his final task. He wrote letters to Minerva, to Severus, to others who would need guidance after he was gone. Instructions, contingencies, truths that could only be revealed at the proper time. And at the bottom of the stack, he placed his manual for guardianship, everything he had learned about caring for Hogwarts across 70 years. Not rules exactly, more like observations, suggestions, the accumulated wisdom of someone who had listened to the castle and learned its language. For the next keeper, he wrote on the cover, learn to listen. That's the only instruction that truly matters. Everything else will follow. Outside his window, dawn was breaking over the castle, touching the towers with gold, warming the stones after the long night. A new day beginning, as it always did at Hogwarts, as it always would, long after he was gone. Albus Dumbledore, 115 years old and dying, watched that sunrise with gratitude. He had been given time, more than most, to do what needed doing, to prepare the castle, to strengthen its defenses, to ensure it would survive without him. His work was nearly done, and Hogwarts, patient as ever, would continue. The night arrived without ceremony. No dramatic shift in the air. No ominous thunder. Just the quiet darkness of a June evening settling over Hogwarts as it had settled over 1,000 June evenings before. The castle breathed with its usual rhythms. House elves tending fires that needed no tending, portraits murmuring in their frames, the lake lapping gently against the shore far below. Albus Dumbledore stood atop the astronomy tower, his blackened hand hidden beneath his robes, and waited. He had known this night would come, had prepared for it, planned for it, accepted it with the same patience he had learned from Hogwarts itself. Everything was in place, the instructions written, the protections laid, the guardianship passed on as much as it could be passed to living hands. Minerva knew what she needed to know. Severus understood his role. The portraits were ready. All that remained was the final act. The door behind him opened. Footsteps on stone. Voices. Draco Malfoy's trembling with fear and uncertainty. And then others. Death Eaters summoned through. The vanishing cabinet that Albus had known about for months had chosen not to destroy because some plans required sacrifice, required difficult choices, required one person to stand in the gap so others might live. "Good evening, Draco," Albus said quietly, and the words that followed were both script and truth, performance and reality, the careful orchestration of an ending that would serve as a beginning for those who survived. The moment Severus's curse struck him, green light, the killing curse spoken with anguish disguised as hatred, Hogwarts felt it. Every portrait in the castle gasped simultaneously, paint and canvas suddenly alive with shock. The house elves froze mid-motion, feeling the rupture in the castle's awareness like a physical blow. The ghosts stopped their drifting, their translucent forms shimmering with distress. Even Peeves, chaotic Peeves who respected nothing and no one, went completely still. The headmaster had fallen. And the castle, which had known his sole presence for 70 years, which had felt his footsteps on its stones since he was 12 years old, which had partnered with him through decades of care and protection and patient attention. The castle felt his absence like an earthquake, not a literal tremor. The stones didn't crack, the towers didn't sway, but something fundamental shifted in Hogwarts awareness, a grief that rippled through every corridor, every classroom, every hidden space that Albus had discovered and tended and loved. The portraits wept openly now, their painted tears real in the only way that mattered. In the headmaster's office, Albus's own portrait began to form, paint and magic coalescing into memory and continuation, though it would be hours before he could speak, before he could be more than canvas and colour. The house elves gathered in the kitchens, holding each other, their ancient eyes streaming with tears. "He's gone," Mimsy whispered, her voice breaking. "The keeper is gone." The ghosts converged in the great hall where Albus's body would soon lie in state. They formed an honor guard without being asked, translucent forms surrounding the space where he would rest, keeping vigil as only the dead could, for one who had joined their realm of memory. And throughout it all, the castle itself grieved. not in ways that humans would grieve, not with tears or wails or demonstrations of sorrow, but in its own language, the language Albus had spent a lifetime learning to understand. Fires dimmed throughout Hogwarts, burning lower than they should, as though the castle itself had lost some essential warmth. The stones grew cold, not with winter's chill, but with absence, with the space left by someone who had been woven so deeply into the castle's fabric that removing him left holes nothing could immediately fill. Doors closed that had stood open, passages sealed that had been accessible. The castle drew into itself, protecting its vulnerability the only way it knew how, by hiding what it could not defend in its current wounded state. But even in grief, even in the immediate shock of loss, Hogwarts remembered what Albus had taught it, remembered the protections he had laid, the preparations he had made, the trust he had placed in the castle to continue without him. In the room of requirement, his manual for guardianship remained where he had left it, waiting for the next keeper to find it. The wards he had strengthened over his final months hummed with quiet power, self-sustaining now, requiring no living guardian to maintain them. The network of portraits and ghosts and house elves he had organized into a web of awareness remained intact, ready to serve whoever came next. And in the hidden classroom on the 4th floor, his final note waited on the desk his ancestor had used, the desk he had used, the desk that would welcome the next student or teacher or headmaster who learned to listen to what the castle was trying to say. The dawn came slowly, reluctantly, grey, light touching the towers, revealing the signs of battle, scorch marks on stone, broken glass, the evidence of Death Eaters who had breached the castle's defences but had not broken its spirit. Students emerged from their dormitories to find the castle changed, not physically, not in any way they could precisely articulate, but changed nonetheless, quieter, more watchful, as though Hogwarts itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. In the great hall, they gathered around Albus's body, paying their respects to the headmaster who had protected them, guided them, created a home for everyone who walked these corridors. The teachers stood guard, their faces drawn with grief. Minerva stood at the head of the bier, her expression composed through sheer force of will, already carrying the weight she would bear as his successor. Outside, the centaurs emerged from the forbidden forest, a rare sight, a significant one. They stood at the forest's edge, their bows lowered in respect, acknowledging the passing of someone who had understood the old agreements, who had honored the boundaries between castle and forest that dated back to the founders themselves. The merpeople surfaced in the lake, their songs rising in the still morning air, not cheerful, not welcoming, but mournful and beautiful, a tribute from creatures who rarely acknowledged the human world above the water. Even the castle's architecture seemed to respond. The gargoyles that guarded various passages lowered their stone heads. The suits of armor stood at attention, their empty visors somehow conveying solemnity. The very walls seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, as though Hogwarts was trying to comfort those within it, even while processing its own loss. In his portrait, Albus's painted eyes opened. He looked around the office, at Fawkes perching mournfully, at the other portraits watching him with relief and sorrow mixed, at the desk where he had worked for decades, now soon to be Minerva's. "Hello," he said quietly. "I'm still here then." In a manner of speaking, replied Armando Dippett's portrait. "Welcome to the walls, Albus. We've been waiting for you." And Albus understood, with a clarity that perhaps only death could bring, that his guardianship had not ended. It had simply changed form. As a portrait, he would remain at Hogwarts, would continue to advise and guide and remember, would be part of the castle's accumulated wisdom for as long as the paintings lasted. He had become part of Hogwarts' eternal presence, woven into its stones, not just through magic and protections, but through memory and continuation. Another voice in the long conversation between the castle and its keepers. Another layer in the accumulated care that stretched back through centuries and would stretch forward through centuries more. The funeral took place at sunset, the time between day and night, between what was and what would be. They buried him beside the lake he had loved, where he could hear the water and feel the castle's presence even in death. And as the last words were spoken, as the final tributes were paid, Hogwarts did something it had done only a handful of times in its 1,000-year history. Every bell in every tower rang simultaneously, not the usual announcing of hours or calling students to meals, but something deeper, more resonant, an acknowledgement, a farewell, a promise. The keeper had fallen, but the castle remained. The protections Albus had laid would continue. The network of guardianship he had built would persist. The students he had sheltered would carry forward the lessons he had taught, not just about magic, but about care, about attention, about the importance of listening to what needed protecting and having the courage to protect it. Minerva McGonagall climbed the stairs to the headmaster's office, her office now, and felt the castle welcome her with warmth that helped ease the grief. The portraits watched her with approval. Forks trilled softly, and on the desk she found Albus's manual, his final gift to her and to all who had come after. She opened it, reading his familiar handwriting, and felt tears slide down her cheeks. But she also felt something else: determination, purpose, the understanding that she was now part of something larger than herself, part of the long chain of guardians who had protected Hogwarts across the ages. "I'll do my best," she said quietly to the castle, to Albus's portrait, to the accumulated presence of everyone who had ever loved this place enough to defend it. "I'll listen, I'll learn, I'll keep what you've built." And Hogwarts, ancient and patient and newly aware of its own vulnerability, settled around her like a cloak, accepting her, trusting her, ready to teach her everything Albus had learned, everything his ancestor had learned, everything the keepers needed to know. Outside, night fell completely. Stars emerged over the towers. The lake reflected moonlight. The forbidden forest rustled with its eternal mysteries. And within Hogwarts' walls, students slept in dormitories warmed by house elf care, protected by wards laid across generations, safe within a castle that had endured wars and losses and griefs beyond counting. The keeper had fallen, but Hogwarts endured, as it always had, as it always would, for as long as there were those willing to listen, to learn, to stand guard through the darkest nights. Hogwarts would remain, a home, a refuge, a place where small comforts mattered, where daily care accumulated into something powerful, where the stones themselves remembered everyone who had ever loved them. And somewhere in the hidden classroom on the 4th floor, the wall warmed in recognition of the next keeper who would someday find their way there, who would read the accumulated notes, who would add their own observations to the eternal archive. The castle was ready, patient as stone, ancient as magic itself, waiting to teach the next generation what it meant to truly keep something worth keeping.